give everyone maybe one more minute, and then we can go ahead and get started. All right, expecting that a few people will probably join us as we start. I'm going to go ahead and get started so our fellows can present and hand it over to Samir for some opening remarks.
Great, thank you, Brigida. And want to welcome everyone here today, this morning, this evening. For many of our visiting fellows, it's this evening, and that's just been how this fellowship has gone over the past year, but we appreciate everyone joining and taking some time to hear about some of the great research that has been incubated over the past year. For those of you who are new to the Stimson Center, let me give you a brief introduction. We're about a 30-year-old think tank based in Washington that started in the late 80s and has been working on global international security issues since then. Very early in our tenure, our co-founder, Michael Crafon, who also founded the South Asia program, had an insight that South Asian geopolitics and strategic issues were going to be very important in the 21st century for the United States. And so started one of the earliest programs on this. And we've been hosting visiting fellows at the Stimson Center since the early 1990s. There are now senior officials who were once fellows at the Stimson Center. So I think that bodes well for our current cohort of South Asian Voices visiting fellows. The fellowship over the last maybe last decade or a little bit less than that has oriented around our premier online virtual platform, South Asian Voices, which is a policy platform for analysis, research, debate, discussion on all things Southern Asia, South Asia, geopolitics, security, strategy, deterrence, economics, and I think it's grown tremendously under the leadership of both Akriti Vasudeva and Brigida Schauert and our fantastic editorial team. And the visiting fellowship is essentially designed to bring these scholars to Washington to interface with other scholars and policymakers here in DC to contribute new analysis. And this year, obviously, it's been a bit of an adjustment. I think our cohort has adapted very well to it, and we're all dealing with these challenging times. But rather than skip this year's fellowship, we decided to build a new architecture around a virtual fellowship that has been, I think, facilitated by not only a fantastic team at Stimson, but a number of our non-resident fellows, mentors, and scholars and analysts around the Washington area who have done over 30 meetings with our visiting fellow cohort this year. So what you're going to hear today are presentations on ongoing research. These are not finalized products. And I think in some ways, this is an opportunity for feedback and development. And you're going to hear on projects that range from counterterrorism and Afghanistan-Pakistan relations to deterrence dynamics to alignments or new alignments that are sort of rebuilding in the Indo-Pacific, and that sort of stretches the gamut of the strategic issues that we at the Stimson Center and the South Asia program try to engage on. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to turn it over to our fearless leader of today's events, but also who's been leading this fellowship, Brigida, and I'm looking forward to hearing what the visiting fellows have to present to us today. Over to you, Brigida.
Thank you so much, Samir. And thank you all for joining us this morning or evening for those of you joining from South Asia. I'm Brigida Schukert, a research associate at the Stimson Center and managing editor for South Asian Voices, an online policy platform that features analysis on the security, politics, and economics of the subcontinent. I'm delighted to welcome you to our first webinar of 2021, where our visiting fellows, Asma Khalid, Chirag Thakar, Fizza Batul, and Sarab Sakar will present on the research they have done over the past year as visiting fellows with the Stimson Center South Asia program. Each of them will present for about 10 minutes on the key findings of their research and policy recommendations for decision makers in the United States and South Asia. The research will be presented in full in the coming months in policy memos published with the Stimson Center. So just to briefly introduce our speakers for today before handing it over to them. And first, I would like to say a thank you to all of our visiting fellows who started their fellowship in early 2020 and have kind of borne with us as we reworked this fellowship and moved it to being remote. And I think they've done some excellent research over this past year and during their meetings in the DC area, at least remotely. So presenting first today will be Asma Khalid, a research associate at the Center for Strategic and Contemporary Research in Islamabad. She'll be presenting her findings on India-Pakistan deterrence dynamics following the Pulwama-Balakot crisis. Next, we'll have Chirayu Thakar, who is a doctoral candidate in international relations and is joining us very late this evening from the National University of Singapore. He will be presenting his research on US-India convergences and divisions in multilateral institutions. After Asma and Chirayu's presentations, we will move to visiting fellows research on Afghanistan, beginning with Fiza Batul, doctoral candidate and teacher at the University of Karachi, who will be discussing the role of Pakistani political parties in the Afghanistan peace process. Finally, Saurav Sakar, a research associate at the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi, will be presenting his findings on ISKP's potential role as a spoiler during the intra-Afghan negotiation process. To give us more time for discussion at the end, we will move straight into fellow presentations. If time allows, after each fellow presents, I'll ask one question before moving on to the next. And then at the end, we'll open up for questions from the audience. Please do leave any questions that you have, particularly as earlier fellows are presenting in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many as we can at the end of the discussion. And I'll also ask our panelists to keep their responses to questions short so we could try to have some back and forth and time for discussion at the end. With that, I will hand it over to Asma Khalid, who will be giving our first presentation.
Thanks, Brigitta. Hello, everyone. First of all, I'm grateful to Stimson Center South Asian Voices team for granting me the opportunity to present my research findings. My research on Balakot Rajouri crisis of 2019 aims to explore the claims in both India and Pakistan's narrative accounts and possible implications of competing narratives for South Asian security and strategic stability. It also recommends policy options for decision makers in Islamabad and New Delhi. Next slide, please. I will try to address a single question in this presentation: how the emerging narratives after Balakot Rajouri crisis may impact the crisis stability between India and Pakistan, and why this is important for policymakers to understand. I will give a brief recap of Balakot Rajouri crisis and the contending narratives over it, and then I will present my policy recommendations over the emerging situation in South Asia. Next slide, please. So on 14 February 2019, a Kashmiri young man carried out a suicide attack on a convoy of Indian paramilitary forces in Pulwama, a district of Indian-administered Kashmir. New Delhi blamed it on Pakistan-based militant group Jaish-e-Mohammed. Islamabad refuted the allegation and asked New Delhi for actionable evidence regarding the involvement of any Pakistani in sponsorship of the attack. Regardless, on 26 February 2019, Indian Air Force carried out an airstrike in Balakot, Pakistan, in an attempt to destroy a presumed Jaish-e-Mohammed camp. Only that payload dropped in a forest. For Pakistan, it was a serious violation of its territorial sovereignty. The following day, Pakistan's retaliatory airstrike near the Indian military facilities in Rajouri sector of Indian-administered Kashmir resulted in an aerial dogfight in which Pakistan Air Force reportedly shot down a couple of Indian jets and captured a pilot. The situation was tense, but Pakistan's release of captured pilot eased it off. For the record, India conducted an airstrike in mainland territory of nuclear state Pakistan, and as a result, the aerial crash occurred between two nuclear weapon states. In essence, this shows that in the February 2019 crisis between India and Pakistan reinforced this fragility of strategic stability in South Asia. Next slide, please. So over a year, India and Pakistan's policy elites and strategic community have maintained competing narratives following the airstrike. In India, the narrative after Balakot airstrike has emphasized establishing new normal through which India sought to signal to the Pakistan that whenever there would be a terrorist attack in India, it would be followed by a limited tactical or surgical strike against the alleged militant camps in Pakistan. On Pakistan's part, the country's strategic community sought to stress the effectiveness of its conventional military capability. Pakistan's policymakers and think tank community tend to argue that Pakistan's response to India's kind of hit and run aerial tactics does not require the nuclear option, and Islamabad can deter such military adventures with its conventional military capability. Pakistan strongly believes that India's mere reliance on the threats following Pakistan's shooting down of Indian jets and avoidance of riding the second rung of an escalation ladder reinforced the effectiveness of Pakistan's nuclear deterrence and restored its conventional deterrence. So, heading toward post-Pulwama dynamics, in post-Balakot Rajouri crisis, next slide please. The potential for strategic instability between India and Pakistan has grown wider as states are more intensely trying to revise their military strategies and enhance their military capabilities to deal with impending security crises. The Pulwama crisis could be viewed through the prism of new situation instead of new normal, in which India is engaged in large-scale military and strategic force modernization and has been investing in sea-based deterrence. It is manifested in India's ongoing improvement, production, and induction of land, air, and sea-based strategic weapons to expand the scope of its military operation. Since the Balakot Rajouri crisis, India has developed Pakistan-specific dual-capable missile capabilities, including the test and induction of short-range missile system and strengthening its sea-based deterrence. India's technological modernization, rearmament, and growing missile forces to conduct counter-strikes roles are prone to widen Pakistan's threat parameters. For these reasons, Islamabad believes that India may create another pretext to conduct a limited war strike against Pakistan. In particular, India's no first use principle and preemptive strike signifies the possibility of military adventures against Pakistan. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has raised his concerns regularly regarding the prospects of false flag operations on part of India. To counter such a likelihood, Islamabad has instated the quid pro quo plus strategy, the primary objective of which is to neutralize external aggression by maintaining conventional deterrence and preventing the scope of limited strike in future. This strategy demonstrates that Pakistan will react to any future threat with an offensive counter-strike of larger proportion. These quid pro quo plus strategy signals Islamabad revised understanding that South Asian limited war scenario of hit and run tactic could be averted by deterring any Indian military attack by threatening the disproportionate counter-strike regardless of ensuing escalation dynamics. Next slide, please. So another dynamic that marks the instability in the strategic landscape of South Asia is potential escalation of conflict due to misconceptions or miscalculation of actual and perceived capabilities of adversaries. The contradictory narratives which are being propelled by both states allow both states to claim victory and boost their confidence to go for kinetic force option during a crisis. Miscalculation and misperception of the adversary's capabilities and an attempt to establish a space for limited war among nuclear weapon states represent alarming signpost of an unintentional nuclear escalation in the region. Keeping in mind these scenarios, I have identified a few policy recommendations for policymakers in Pakistan and New Delhi. In next slide, please. So these emerging dynamics requires in the first place a need to restore and reinforce the existing confidence building measures between India and Pakistan to reduce hostility and promote mutual approaches toward peace. For the starter, I would recommend the establishing arms control regime and proposed strategic restraint regime. In the emerging security dynamic, this could be a viable measure to address mutually perceived threats, overcome the trust deficit, and reduce arms race instability that is fueling security dilemmas between both states. Second, I would recommend activating the SARC as an active regional actor in South Asia. The restoration of South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation can play a central role in stabilizing the bilateral tension between India and Pakistan. Third, I would recommend developing regional mechanism for combating terrorism. As terrorism a mutual concern for both India and Pakistan, well, India shies away from engaging in talks with Pakistan until some action of its liking is taken against Pakistan-based militant accused of terrorist attacks in India. In a way, this serves the objectives of those terrorists. By not engaging in talks, it serves the objectives of those militants that is India and Pakistan will continue to lock in the horns. As a way forward to combat terrorism, Pakistan and India could follow European Union model of developing coordinators from the third party nationality that the both states would equally trust. Fourth recommendation that comes to my mind is having a functional and actual use of military DGMOs. Risk escalation in the Balakot Rajouri crisis shows that both states should operationalize suspended hotlines of Director Generals of Operations and Management to fill the communication gap. Effective implementation of DGMO to DGMO hotline framework should be based on undertaking sincere measures by conducting daily use of these hotlines to improve existing situation. Such high levels of communication channels will reduce the probability of miscalculation and false flag operations in future. So next slide, please. So having said that, to conclude, I would say that in times of military crisis, instead of resorting to an offensive action, India and Pakistan should maintain political and military flexibility and utilize communication channels to manage the crisis. A comprehensive mechanism for political cooperation and military restraints is inevitable in a delicate security environment as one is South Asia. I will stop here. Thank you so much for your patience and listening.
Thank you so much, Asma. And we'll open this up for broader questions at the end. So please do send any questions that you have from Asma into our Q&A box below. Asma, just one question for you before we move on to our next speaker. One of the points that you brought up in terms of confidence building measures was revoking or using more of the framework for SARC, although we have seen in the past that SARC meetings are often the first to get canceled in case of tensions or disputes between members, often India and Pakistan. So what would be your sort of follow-up recommendations? Follow-up recommendations for ways to best mitigate that, or have that as something that maybe has more of a, maybe more teeth or source as a regional mechanism?
Okay. We see that SARC has often received criticism for its inability to function because of regional disputes among SARC members. I think there could be the multiple possible steps to overcome the limitations of SARC. One of the basic functions of regional organization could be to provide a platform to adversarial countries. So SARC is a good platform to at least to talk with each other, and it would be a good initiative to interact, and things might start moving from there. The second step, I think, SARC provides an opportunity for regional actors to cooperate in non-political areas such as technical, economic, cultural, and scientific sectors. Cooperation on these sectors would enhance the mutual advantages for both India and Pakistan. And cooperation in non-political areas without compromising on national security issues might have spillover impact and may open doors for reducing military tensions between both states. Also, the third step could be calling a SARC summit or SARC meeting. And Pakistan can show its intention to revive SARC while demonstrating its desire to develop economic cooperation and peace in South Asia and schedule a meeting towards that end. Such an initiative would highlight that Pakistan seeks peace and would place public pressure on India if New Delhi continues to turn its back on Pakistan's call for SARC meeting. And it would, if India not agree to attend the SARC meeting, it would also highlight that India's lack of will to engage in efforts to develop regional peace. And in case if India agrees to join the SARC summit on Pakistan's call, then I think it will be a win-win situation for both India, Pakistan, and other SARC members. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. And before I introduce our next speaker, Samir wanted me to say something he forgot to mention in his opening remarks, and that is to thank all of those who helped make this fellowship possible with their generous support, namely the Carnegie Corporation, the MacArthur Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Energy. With that, I will hand it over to Chirayu for his presentation on U.S.-India tensions and cooperation at multilateral institutions.
Thank you, Brigitte. I'm audible?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, those who are joining us from the States, and good evening to the people, those who are joining us from the subcontinent. I'm one of the 4 visiting fellows for the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. And last year whole, I was researching on one of the under-researched and under-explored aspect of India-US relationship, which is the dynamics at the United Nations. And I have deliberately titled it Friends Elsewhere, Foes at the UN, to show that the flourishing dynamics and the flourishing bilateral relationship has not ended in that level of proximity at United Nations and other multilateral fora. Next slide, please. Okay, so why study India-US relationship at the UN and why now? So next, please. Yeah, so most recently with the incoming administration, Secretary Blinken, during his nomination, he said that when current President Biden, when he was a senator in 2006, he said that in the future, India and US, they both will be they will be the closest friends together, closest countries together. And many believe that India-US relationship is the defining relationship of our time. Next, please. And this is not merely rhetorical flourish that we see on the part of politicians. We also see this as we also notice that this is a bipartisan success story and it has trickled down into policy as well. So here I'm quoting a joint regional strategy between the bureaus of South and Central Asia. And they specifically mentioned that the US wants to champion for India's rise as a like-minded strategic partner at the United Nations. So the US side believes in India as a democratic partner. There is a value-based partnership on which US can rely at a later stage. Next, please. And it is not merely the US side, even the India side. They believe, as many lawmakers and diplomats, they put it metaphorically, that India's road to United Nations Security Council, it passes through Washington. So one of the critical demands from the Indian side is that they want US's support at the time when UN reforms, whenever it happens. So US sees India as a future important partner, and India sees US as critical to its rise. And despite this bilateral intent, we do not see a huge convergence. And this convergence is not only seen in terms of number, it has a spillover effect in actual diplomacy. Next, please. Yeah, so This is the United States Deputy Chief of Mission in India saying to a senior bureaucrat in a leaked cable that India's obstinate role is increasingly at odds with the emerging strategic partnership. So it has been flummoxing not only observers outside like us, but actual practitioners of diplomacy. They also see it as a pertinent puzzle that why this flourishing bilateral relationship, emerging relationship, is not translating into proximity at the United Nations. Now, this is the question, but we also need to quantify this question as an analyst. Next slide, please. Sorry, this is a bit crowded map, and once you will have the policy memo, you can look into detail. So these are United States strategic partners. And I have just taken United Nations General Assembly as an indicator to understand how wide the gap is. And every year there are 200 or 300 votes that happen at the United Nations General Assembly. We are not counting on all of them because many of them are consensus, many of them are not relevant. But there are around 15 to 20 votes that the State Department marks as important, and they really want their partners, their allies to support United States on those important votes. And here in the graph, what you see basically is the allies in descending order of support that they have extended to the US between 2000 and 2019. And I have chosen this period of 2000 and 2019 because this is the time when actually we see a turn in India-US relationship. Next, please. And here, I have now highlighted the 3 Quad countries. As these countries, they think that it is their job to maintain the free and open Indo-Pacific. They feel that the biggest assault in our current time is to the rules-based order, and they see as democratic partners their job to uphold this order. Now here, apart from US, the 3 other countries, Australia, Japan, and India, and you can see how varied their position is. On the top, you see Australia, a little over 80%. In the mid somewhere, Japan, that has extended support to US on important issues, somewhere around 80%. And then in the lowest bottom area, you see India with just 20% of support. It means that India and US not only look at each other eye to eye, fail to look at each other eye to eye, but there is a huge gap between their understanding of rules-based order or global issues and their positions. Next slide, please. So from this quantitative understanding of gap, I look into the reasons for this lack of convergence. Next, please. So I parse this into 3 different types and details you can read in the memo. The first one is what I call the strategic thinking of India, how India thinks about multilateral institution. And the first thing, India sees United Nations as a number game. And when the D-Day, the judgment day of United Nations reforms comes up, India wants to present its case to the world with broadest possible coalition supporting its bid. And this can only be done by not alienating as many smaller constituency as possible. Now, United Nations, again, is a number game. Around 100 countries are there with population less than 10 million. And those countries, they belong to Global South. So India naturally tends to ally with them, keeping this long-term strategy in mind. Next, please. Second, until the Security Council reform happens and India is accepted as a leader by the global community, India wants as many issues to be dealt at the level of General Assembly because that allows it the space to assert itself as a leader. And on the other side, the US and the P5 countries, although they may squabble and bicker among themselves, they want as many issues to be dealt at the level of Security Council. So India wants a broader remit for General Assembly, the P5 wants a broader remit for Security Council, and this puts India at odds with the US. Next, please. Then there are some legacy issues, thematic issues. I go into detail, committee-wise committee in General Assembly and other UN organs as well in my memo. The issue of non-proliferation, because India is not a signatory of NPT. So again, it puts India at odds with the US. Although there is NSG waiver, India is now practically accepted as an NWS. There is a nuclear weapon state, but still India remains, has a principled position. colonialism, given its past experiences, human rights. India sees human rights issues as a name and shame game. Privately, they admit that way. And they see it as in some cases, they see it as a first stepping stone towards military intervention and regime change operations. Again, economic issues, India is at odds. Now, these are mostly the issues of global South, and many strategic thinkers within India call it third worldism. And they say that India should shed its third worldism. And even Indian thinks that they have to think differently as a leader. But again, as I said, the strategy of number game, it overpowers India's situation or India's voting behavior. Next, please. Apart from that, there are regional issues. I have only brought two here. Israel-Palestine is one. Given Muslim sensibilities at home and reliance on Middle Eastern oil makes India vote in a certain way. Russia has been always a net veto provider, a more reliable partner, because United States has been capricious and always had tried to engage in balancing act between India and Pakistan. Compared to that, Russia has been a stable, reliable partner. So India doesn't want to upset its relation. And of course, Samir, who introduced us, has written recently a nice paper that 86% of India's inventory, arms inventory, belongs to Russia. So there is a defense tie, strong defense tie as well, which India does not want to upset. So these are some of the broad areas and some of the strategic reasons that puts India at odds with the United States. Next. But it would be a huge remiss if I were to look only at the past and not pick up emerging trend lines. And what are the emerging trend lines? There are areas where possible cooperation has started or cooperation has actually taking place. And that is the reason I called India an ally in making in the last part of my memo. So next, please. So one of the areas is climate change. Climate change is an actual threat for vast metropolises on the coastline for India as well. And apart from that, India sees it as a global leadership issue. So this is one thing to be kept in mind. So climate change, India has dramatically changed its position, and in the days and years to come, India would be taking more proactive situation where United States and India can work together. Next, please. China is another area where you don't need to tell either of them that you have to work together. They are already working together, and perhaps they'll work immediately together. It's an alarming situation for both of them. So most recent examples of their working together is many Chinese diplomats, they surreptitiously tried to include elements of Z thought or extolling the virtues of BRI in General Assembly resolutions by sleight of hand. And EU, Indian, and US diplomats, they tried to scrub off this together. So already a lot of cooperation on China and has started to happen. Next, please. Other areas of convergence, Israel, the Arab-Israeli truce as it is happening, India can change its position in Israel. Already, we have seen a couple of votes where this situation has changed. Iran, India has on and off supporting the US, particularly at the IAEA. Afghanistan, terrorism. In fact, India wants to do more than US on terrorism. It is India who is pressing for CCIT, that is the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism, health, nuclear energy. These are possible areas of cooperation where India is willing to change. But there are two particular things I see as potential stumbling blocks. Like there are a lot of policy recommendations that I put out, but two major stumbling blocks I see that US, if it keeps in mind, then it can get better cooperation from India. Next, please. And the first one is that India is more willing to change its position if it sees a leadership space for itself. And the more United States appreciates this position of India, like climate change. Not only climate change was a position change, but it was also a leadership issue. So wherever the US tends or willing to appreciate more of India's leadership aspirations, India would be more supportive and cooperative. Second, on the areas that I have mentioned earlier, they both want to agree, but where they differ is the modalities of how to agree. And privately, they air their grievances and grudges. But what I feel is, instead of talking to analysts like us, if they both sit across together and air their grievances and their differences in modalities, talk to each other, then I think both democratic partners, they need to work together. The cost so far has been very low. It has been a small irritant in the relationship, but as both work together, as both take the leadership of the democratic world in the days to come, I think it is important that they strive to improve this particular aspect of bilateral as well. Next slide. Thank you so much for your patient listening. And if you are seriously interested in the subject, do read the memo and share your thoughts. Thank you again.
Thank you, Chirayu. So just one question before we move on to our next fellow presentations. One thing that you've written about for SAV is India's history of abstaining from votes at the United Nations. Going forward, as you look at these sort of discrepancies, particularly in US-India voting patterns, do you see abstaining as something that remains a part of an important strategy for India in terms of balancing its own interests and regional relationships?
Abstentions have played differently in both settings of General Assembly and the Security Council. At General Assembly, given that number game mindset, what India usually thinks is that if my vote is not going to change anything, let me abstain when a friend is involved. So instead of upsetting a friend, India would try to abstain. And many countries engage in this level of thing. Why India became notoriously famous for its abstentions, it was during its earlier stint at the Security Council during 2011-12. So anything that involved US versus Russia or US versus Russia and China, India said, I don't want to get into your power politics. I would abstain myself. And that is the reason why we see a lot of abstentions on Crimea, earlier on Syria, after which India changed its position a little bit. But this, wherever it came, wherever the situation of great power politics comes, India has chosen to abstain itself. And even the strategic thinkers within India has not appreciated this particular abstention strategy. The article that you mentioned, therein I have said, and I think my opinion has been most recently echoed by India's permanent representative as well, that India is most likely to change its position or its abstention way of responding to great power politics. So I have given an example that in Syria, there are two particular issues. One is purely political of how to handle the Assad regime. And the second is the humanitarian issue where crossings and give and take of humanitarian aid, that is also dealt at the level of Security Council. So India has said that it is going to change its abstention strategy and might support the crossing issue, where United States and European partners, they want more humanitarian aid to go. And compared to that, I think on absolutely political issues, India would continue abstaining because it doesn't want more challenges at its doorstep. So I see the little bit change in position based on issue areas. And there the role of diplomats become important because they have to determine what is the red line for India. Thank you.
Thank you, Chirayu. And with that, we're going to switch gears a little bit and refocus on our fellow presentations on Afghanistan, starting with Fizza Batul.
Thank you, Brigitta, and thank you, Stimson Center, for giving me this opportunity to add a new geographical area in my research interest, Afghanistan. So the topic I chose to focus on is the role of Pakistani political parties in Afghanistan peace process, mainly because this particular actor has not received the attention from the policy community. And in this policy memo, I will try and explain why it should receive attention. The next slide, please. So let's begin by diagnosing the problem, and then I can tell you what solutions Pakistani political parties can provide. So despite a decade of sincere efforts by international community for democratization in Afghanistan, it has not unfolded according to the expectations. In addition to the growing violence and extension of Taliban-controlled area, a major impediment to democratic development in Afghanistan has been corruption and poor governance by the elected regime. And then the presidential constitution granting authority to central government in an ethnically and religiously diverse country, it has resulted in local warlords taking control over distant areas from Kabul. So why did it happen? I believe that so far, the foreign support Afghanistan received from democratization had several problems. At first, it was very event focused. It was very focused on elections, which is okay because the process of democratization often begins from elections. But the problem is the idealistic expectations attached with this event, these event-focused efforts. So somehow, just through election, the society of Afghanistan was expected to change and become more democratic. That was not possible. Second, with the explicit involvement of these international actors in democratization in Afghanistan, they unintentionally substantiated the opposition criticism of President Karzai as foreign agent and democracy as a foreign system imposed on Afghanistan. Third, the efforts were very inconsistent. So the objectives started from counterterrorism, then moved to nation building and democratization. And now we are back to a narrower target of ending the war through a negotiated settlement while securing limited counterterrorism objectives. Next slide, please. Now, keeping these three issues in mind of idealistic expectations, number two, the foreign tag that takes away the trust element, number three, the inconsistency in efforts. Let me explain what the political party I chose can do for Afghanistan. So I was focusing on three Islamist political parties, Jamaat-e-Islami, Jamiat Ulama-e-Islam Fazlur Rahman, Jamiat Ulama-e-Islam Samil Haq Group, and four Pashtun political parties, Awami National Party, Pakhtunkhwa Milli Awami Party, PKMAP, Qawmi Watan Party, and Pakhtun Tahaffuz Movement, which is not really a political party, but a proto-political party. Two of its members are in National Assembly, but I did not skip PTM because it has strong influence in the former FATA region. So the chart on your screens show the political actors in Afghanistan with which these Pakistani political parties had some relationship. And I focused on Taliban, Peshawar 7, the 7 political parties Pakistan supported, and some key political personalities in the current Kabul government. So I found that all four Pashtun political parties claim to have relationship with ex-President Hamid Karzai and current President Ashraf Ghani. Next. And all three Islamist political parties claim to have relationship with Taliban. So the dotted line between Jamaat-e-Islami and Taliban you're seeing is because although Jamaat leader I interviewed held that they have ties with Taliban, the neutral sources like journalists and analysts held that Jamaat has closer ties with Rabbani-led Jamiat-e-Islami and Hizb Islami of Hikmat Yar. So not really with Taliban, but I kept that dotted line because the leaders I interviewed claimed so. Next. Abdullah, and I'm emphasizing on Abdullah specifically is because to explain a point. Abdullah worked with Jamaat-e-Islami, but he does not enjoy ties with any political actors in Pakistan. And this could be because although his father was Pashtun, his mother is Tajik, and he grew up with his mother's family. And this Pashtun identity matters a lot in Pakistan, even if you're trying to make relationship with an Islamist political party. Next slide, please. Now, the relationship I presented in the chart are very deep-rooted, non-formal human relations and are very long-term relations. The roots of these relations goes back to the arrivals of Muslims in this region from 9th century onward. Tribal ties are very strong. So when I mentioned Hamid Karzai in my interviews, the respondent showed respect not to the ex-president of Afghanistan, but to a tribal leader, which they were respecting even before he was an ex-president. He was a president. Then these tribal relations often get solidified into form family relations through intermarriages. So, for instance, Afrasiab Khattak, who was previously in Awami National Party, is currently in PTM. He got married in Afghanistan when he was serving under Najibullah government, and so his in-laws are still in Afghanistan, and family relationship is there. And then some of the politicians like Achakzai, their families are involved in trade and economic relationship with Afghanistan. So, and then during Soviet Afghan war, the Islamist political parties also started building a strong presence in Afghanistan. So you can see that these political parties naturally have higher stakes in the political stability in Afghanistan. And unlike the international community, they are not going anywhere. They can set long-term goals. They can use this multi-pronged relations to bring peace in Afghanistan. Next. Second, the political parties in Afghanistan and Pakistan have similar experiences. They both operate in multi-party Islamist democratic system. They both have faced several interruptions in the democratic process, and they both lack internal democratic practices, suffer from patronage politics, authoritarian culture, internal fragmentation. So because of these similarities, when a Pakistani political party talk of democracy in Afghanistan, it is not the liberal democracy international community tried and established in Afghanistan. These political parties understand the limitation of Afghan society, and they would work with more realistic expectations. Next slide. A third and very important, political parties in Pakistan have a relatively better experience with democracy. So they are relatively more organized. They have secure environment compared to Afghanistan for political activism. They are more persistent. So even during, the interruption, the dictatorial regimes, they remained. They served both as a platform of resistance against military dictators, but also as a tool to win popular support. In contrast, political parties in Afghanistan have had fewer opportunities to organize themselves. They usually disappear during the interruption. Then in the post-Taliban period, factional politics has dominated the region. Then the system under which they operate, the single non-transferable vote system, under this system, these parties have to compete with independent candidates and multi-member constituencies. So the system encourages voting for personalities rather political parties. So Pakistani political parties have some context relevant lessons to share with their partners in Afghanistan. And they can bring a small but very important shifts, like managing, making political party understand how to be more organized or how to be more persistent in a difficult situation, and to make them understand the importance of, for instance, federal system. Next slide. So these were my reasons for choosing Pakistani political parties, based on which I started interviewing the leadership of these political parties. And I asked them about their role, what they will do for Afghanistan. And I built three future scenarios, and I asked them specific questions related to that. Next slide. The first scenario I built was a successful completion of the current intra-Afghan dialogue, with continuation of current system with minor changes, and Afghanistan included as a new political actor. Now, since this scenario means that both Islamist and nationalist political parties, political actors would share power in Afghanistan, so the political parties in Pakistan, irrespective of whether they were Pashtun or whether they were Islamists, they all agreed to provide political and moral support to Afghan government. Both said that while they do not like to intervene in the internal matter, they're very much willing to provide consultancy if and when requested by the Afghanistan's political actors. In such a scenario, these political parties, because it would be a peaceful scenario, they would be able to play a role in strengthening diplomatic ties between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And interestingly, all of them, they agree with Pakistan's stance on Durand Line, and that it is an international border, so they can, present Pakistan's stance in those dialogues. But since they have much rooted presence in the Pak-Afghan border society, so they are, if they are involved in diplomatic dialogue between the two countries, they are expected to voice the interest of the people. So they are expected to, for instance, promote having a soft border instead of fencing. One issue that I observed during my interviews was something that I didn't expect, was when I mentioned the scenario, the members of the Islamist political parties explicitly said that democracy cannot work in Afghanistan. And although they were themselves democratic party, but they were not much motivated to democratize Taliban. Pashtun political parties also pointed out the challenges of democratization in Afghanistan, but at least their tone was very pro-democratic, and they wanted to do as much as they can for strengthening democratic institutions in Afghanistan. Next slide. Second scenario was the most likely scenario as per the respondent, which was the stalemate in Afghanistan reverting to Taliban reverting to the use of force while Ghani government continuing with the current republic system. Here there was much division in the response. So Pashtun political parties almost all held that they would support a democratic government in Kabul and they would raise a voice against Taliban and extremism, something that they're already doing. In Islamist political party, there was a slight divide. The UIS leaders, similar group leaders said that they would support Taliban. JUIF leaders, Fazlur Rahman group said that they would adopt a more balanced approach and they would try and approach all political actors, including the Ghani government and the Islamist actors, to restart the negotiation process. And next slide. Third scenario was civil war. In the civil war, the spillover effect would shift parties' attention inward. So they would be more concerned about the possible disruption and security situation in their constituencies in KPK and Balochistan. Some politicians of PTM and PKMAP pointed out that if there is a civil war in Afghanistan, it can incite Pashtun secessionist movement in Pakistan. But most others, including the neutral sources, they said that this is very unlikely. And they provided some valid arguments for that, which I've discussed in the policy memo. So taken together, in the civil war situation, the only limited role these political parties can play is they would voice their opposition to the civil war, and they might play a background covert role in a political settlement between political actors in Afghanistan. Next slide. So based on these findings, these are my policy recommendations for policymakers in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, sorry. First, Pakistan needs to build a unified Afghan policy and should include all domestic political actors, including these political parties. Second, they need to reorient their policy built on Pashtun redundancy. And they need to use this Pashtun relations to bind their diplomatic ties with Afghanistan instead of distancing Afghanistan from it. And very linked to this revision of Afghan policy, they must also expand their involvement in Afghanistan beyond one specific political actor, that is Taliban. They should also build ties with the Islamist and nationalist there, and they can use Pakistani political parties for that. A fourth and last, Pakistani policymakers already have a concern for spillover effect of the growing violence in Afghanistan, but what they've missed is that no fencing can protect terrorism and political instability because these are very intangible forces. So instead, a better approach would be to help the political actors in Afghanistan to build a democratic system there. Finally, for the US policymakers, Afghanistan is a very good lesson to learn, a very good case to understand the limitations of transferring American democracy to non-American lands. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiza. In the interest of time, and because we have a number of excellent audience questions coming in, I'm going to go ahead and move on to Sarv's presentation, and then we will open it for a Q&A for all of our presenters at the end.
Thank you, Brigitte, and I'd also like to thank the Stimson Center for giving us the opportunity to carry out our research over the past year and interacting with various experts and practitioners regarding our topics. So today I'll be speaking on the Islamic State and how it may act as a potential spoiler in the Afghan peace process and some steps that may be taken to counter the terror group. So the Islamic State that I'm looking at is the Afghan affiliate of the Syria and Iraq-based Islamic State, and it's known as the Islamic State in Khorasan province. While its links with the Islamic State Central have at times been shaky and not formal, but recently it has been becoming more semi-autonomous in its approach and activities. Next slide, please. So to introduce the scope and context of the memo, since the signing of the US-Taliban agreement in February of last year and the subsequent intra-Afghan talks, there have been increasingly visible attacks by the Islamic State in Afghanistan's urban areas, specifically in Kabul, Jalalabad, and other important cities. And while counterterrorism measures have affected ISKP's military capabilities, it has not been able to reduce its clandestine or terror capabilities because it continues to carry out sophisticated attacks in urban areas. Recently, it had carried out rocket attacks mounted on vehicles in Kabul's green zone and also on Bagram Air Base that houses US forces. And its attacks, while maintaining the lethality and sophistication, have been capable of causing political chaos between the Afghan government and the Taliban in the ongoing peace talks. Next slide, please. So for the memo, I'll be looking at specifically three things. So firstly, we'll be looking at how ISKP has adopted its strategies due to its military losses and the ongoing peace talks in Afghanistan, how political developments in Afghanistan are affecting its operations and capabilities. And secondly, we'll be looking at how it may act as a spoiler in the ongoing peace negotiations between the Taliban and the government. And finally, we'll be looking at how counterterrorism measures so far against ISKP by Afghan and US forces have been effective, and any forward steps that will be suggested in that regard. Next slide, please. Can I have the bullet points? Yeah. So in the past year, the airstrikes against ISKP have reduced, but the airstrikes in 2019 combined with ground offensives against ISKP positions in Nangarhar had reduced its capabilities significantly. Initially, in 2016, 2017, it had 7,000 to 8,000 fighters, and now it's been reduced to around 2,000 fighters, including non-combatants in certain Salafi pockets of Kunar province. So numerically, its strength has been diminished, but there remain certain sleeper cells in urban areas. However, the major takeaway was that local forces had been able to take and hold territory that was taken from ISKP. That was the turning factor in being able to deny the group space to return. So overall, air power combined with special operation forces and Afghan forces were able to take the territory, and local police forces as well as militias that were raised from local communities by local tribal elders were able to hold the territory to stop them from coming back. So from the graph, it is apparent that in 2020, attacks by ISKP reduced by significantly compared to last year, and there have been more than a half drop in civilian casualties by 61%. And overall, ISKP was responsible for 7% of total casualties in 2020 between the period of 1st January to September 2020. And we can see from the graph that the Taliban still have the major share of civilian casualties, while ISKP is at the bottom of the total share of casualties. Can I have the next slide? The points, please. Well, after its losses and the ongoing security and political developments, its strategies had shifted track. Since the Afghan peace process had started, it has shifted its focus towards South Asia. And while the shift is not physical, it has tailored its propaganda and outreach towards a more South Asian or an Indian subcontinent-based audience, specifically targeting audiences in India, Bangladesh, and Maldives specifically. There have been Indian jihadists, for example, have been given much limelight in recent attacks, and they have adopted more frontline and more prominent roles, giving them increasing visibility in not just propaganda but attacks. So in a way, this is an attempt to inspire other sympathizers in South Asia to join the group and help it rebuild its strength in Afghanistan. Also, since the Islamic State had lost its territory in the Middle East, it has been looking at Afghanistan to branch out its network in the region and make Afghanistan a nerve center for its activities in South Asia. In the short term, ISKP has focused on trying to attract jihadists from other militant groups such as Taliban. However, there is no evidence of any large-scale defections. There may be defections at a granular or a lower level, but there have been no evidence of any large-scale breakaways from any major militant group in Afghanistan. So it has not been able to attract significant fighters to its outfit in the last 2 years. Also, it is trying to engineer political chaos in the negotiations by carrying out attacks on sensitive targets that put both the Afghan government and the Taliban in a difficult position, wherein the Afghan government blames the Taliban for using ISKP to carry out attacks that are not politically palatable, and while the Taliban accused the government of using ISKP as a front to defame the Taliban. Also, recently, some Afghan officials have been targeted, such as judges, police officers, and government officials in Kabul using various precision devices such as magnetic bombs and such. And while many of these attacks have been attributed to ISKP, some of these attacks have remained unclaimed or unattributed. So, ISKP is either carrying out these attacks to weaken the government and the Taliban, or some vested parties are using the ISKP uh, to conveniently target their political rivals. And its propaganda has recently made references to carrying out prison breaks to release its captured militants from prisons. There has been one prison break in Afghanistan that ISKP had carried out in Jalalabad in August of 2020. And since then, there have been more references to such prison breaks that could free a large number of captured ISKP fighters that surrendered or were captured by Afghan forces. And finally, its attacks have become more visible in urban areas as they provide the group with a variety of hard and soft targets, including police and government installations, along with religious places and educational institutes and so on. We have seen attacks ranging from universities to prisons to even medical clinics that even maternity clinics in Kabul. Next slide, please. So it had lost six of its top leaders, known as emirs or governors, in the last 5 to 6 years, along with 550 key leaders. However, this did not reduce the group's lethality. While they may have slowed down the group, but it had always managed to endure its losses and come back with a renewed attack to showcase its strength and relevance. And in the beginning, its structure was a more formal structure attached to Islamic State Central in Syria, with a representative that was in charge of dealing with the liaisoning between ISKP and IS Central. However, with the attacks on ISKP by coalition forces, its structure has become semi-monolithic and loose, and which had given it more tactical mobility to carry out attacks across the country using various terrorist tactics rather than guerrilla attacks. And also in the past, there have been disputes between Pakistani and Afghan / Central Asian members, with the latter accusing the former of working for Pakistani intelligence. However, there is not much evidence to support the claims, but there have been disputes in the past, and presently, I think as much as I could gather, the disputes have been largely worked out, and both Pakistanis, Afghans, Central Asians, and even South Asians are working together currently. And it had shifted to using clandestine cells in urban areas to support its attacks logistically, and using informants to target specialized targets in cities such as secure areas in Kabul and other sensitive installations. And finally, it's also looking to localize itself. There is a notion that it's a foreign entity made up of fighters from Syria or the Arab world, and so currently it's trying to adopt a more Afghan approach, trying to tap into local grievances and exploit local sentiments and political frustrations among certain sections of the population to better recruit and better operate in the country. However, this has had mixed success, with many not taking up ISKP's brand because of its increased brutality and sectarianism. Next slide, please. Its relations with the Afghan and the Pakistani Taliban are something to watch out for. To be short, the Taliban's Islamic Emirate does not doesn't seem compatible with the Salafi ideas of ISKP, given that the Afghan Taliban's leader is known as the Commander of the Faithful, while the Islamic leader also goes with the same title. So there is a difference in terms of ideology, goals, as well as leadership. And also, the United States had indirectly aided the Taliban against ISKP, and in July 2020, the Pakistani Taliban had formally distanced itself from ISKP. So both the Afghan and Pakistani Taliban are not at the moment having any ties with the group. However, it continues to rely on sectarian groups in Pakistan to function Next slide, please. So its potential for being a spoiler is very low given its diminished military capabilities. However, it continues to use terror tactics to cause mistrust between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Any high-profile ISKP attack puts the pressure on the government to react, and often they go after both the Taliban and the Islamic State indiscriminately, thus jeopardizing the peace process. And while security incidents have grown up into had risen in 2020 from 2019, and there have been increase in assassinations as well as suicide attacks. This shows that while ISKP may not be responsible for all of them, but the violence continues, and sometimes the group is conveniently used by both parties to pursue their political ends. Next slide. So finally, the recommendations for the Afghan government would include that there must be increased vigilance and police accountability in urban areas. Police forces are often prone to corruption as well as infiltration by extremist sympathizers. And since many of the attacks happen in secure areas where police presence is very much increased, there needs to be better introspection of the police forces and better discipline to ensure that such incidents are reduced. Border security is a problem going forward because the Afghan border police is very much short-staffed, and there are like around 2.9, 2 to 3 guards per 50 square kilometer, which is very less than optimal. Also, the populations along the frontier regions need to be better protected so that they do not become prone to being overcome by groups like the Taliban or ISKP again. So government protection must be extended to the frontier areas as well. And finally, for the United States government, it has to sustain the training and funding of Afghan counterterrorism forces, especially the Afghan Air Force, so that they take on a more prominent and more proactive role in counterterrorism missions, not just against ISKP, but also against Al Qaeda and others. And lastly, the US Special Operations Forces may remain embedded alongside the Afghan National Security Forces with mutual consent of both parties. Thank you. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saurav, and thank you to all our fellows for their presentations today and the work that you all have been doing over the past year. Opening it now to audience questions, and please do feel free to keep sharing questions in the Q&A box below. Since we do have a number of questions from the audience, I will ask panelists to keep their responses short and concise so we can aim to get to as many as possible. First, Fiza, I have a question for you from Michael Crepon on what scenario in Afghanistan you see as the most likely outcome given your research.
When I talked to the political actors, the most likely scenario, according to them, was the second one, that the Taliban would revert to the use of force and there will be violence, but it would not go to the degree of a civil war situation. So the current government would continue, and this was more like a short-term future scenario. But what they are trying to achieve is the first scenario. The Pakistani government, as well as the political actors within Afghanistan. So the objective is the first scenario. The most likely scenario would be the second one. Civil war is something that's very unlikely because people are actually very tired of violence. So if there is a chance of a civil war, most probably all the political actors would try and end it as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Fiza. And a similar question to you, Saurav, from Polly Nayak from the Stimson Center. How do you assess prospects for one, the Taliban Afghan government agreement? And if an agreement is reached, how likely is this to endure?
The agreement between the Taliban and the Afghan government, well, personally, I'm not much optimistic about an workable agreement at the moment that will last long term. And the endurance will depend on various factors, such as what the United States thinks of it, as well as what regional countries such as Pakistan and India expect out of the agreement. So unless a regional consensus is reached, it will be very difficult to make any agreement last. We have a lot of variables in the equation. We have Iran, Russia, the Central Asian states. So as Asma mentioned in her presentation about activating regional mechanisms, while that is a good notion, but politically achieving them will require a lot of compromise and a lot of introspection among various parties to achieve that end. So right now, I'm not very optimistic about any agreement working out between the Taliban and the Afghan government, at least in the short term, without significant overhauls in the underlying issues between both the parties.
Thanks. And my next question or questions, since there were a couple on this area, is for Asma on the SARC aspect of your recommendations at the conclusion of your presentation. So this is from two questions, one from Farhan Siddiqui and another question from Polly. So the first part is, considering that SARC stands dormant and requires individual and collective actions as part of India and Pakistan to reactivate it, does the SCO or Shanghai Cooperation Organization provide a platform potentially for India and Pakistan to engage, as well as reduce misperceptions? And then another question on SARC from Polly is, given the tensions and the challenges that we have seen with SARC, what might be the role of other countries within the regional organization beyond India and Pakistan to influence its trajectory? Thanks, Asma.
Okay, Shanghai Cooperation Organization or SCO. Yes, indeed. As I already mentioned, one of the basic function of an organization is to provide adversarial countries a platform to engage with each other. Be it SARC or be it or the SCO, they provide a platform to interact with each other. Such platform, there is always a possibilities to leaders from India and Pakistan could meet at least informally and discuss matter of mutual concerns, and such as the foreign ministers or the head of the states could meet informally or on the sidelines, and the things may start moving forward from the onwards. So yes, SCO could help ease off the tension between the two countries. They just need to sit and talk. And about the role of smaller South Asian states, I think that's a good point to make, and I won't hold my breath on it. But I guess Sri Lanka and Bangladesh can play the role of good offices, set good offices and set a neutral platform, whether in Sri Lanka or in Bangladesh, and invite the leaders from Islamabad and New Delhi. I think any initiative that can bring both countries, India and Pakistan, to interact with each other would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. And then Chirayu, next I have a question from you from Akriti Vasudeva, who the editor-at-large at SAV. So her question is, on what areas is there room to build consensus and convergence between the US and India at the UN, particularly during India's time as chair at the UNSC? I'm going to also group this together with a question from Michael as well. I think many of us were struck by your graph in the slide that shows India way at the bottom in terms of voting convergences with the US. So given this background research that you've done, what is the scope and room for India and the US to be full partners or full strategic partners?
Okay, thank you both. It's very encouraging to hear questions from your end. So to the first part pertaining to the 2-year stint of United Nations Security Council, I think there are different roles that India can play. One is actually the subcommittees where India is chairing, particularly the Committee on Taliban, the Sanctions Committee, so on and so forth. But there, I think India's role would be quite limited because there are 4 vice chairs and there are different PAN holders. I think India can sway and support the United States. But again, it's their role as chair is the word chair is quite overrated there, because actually the chair does not have that level of individual power. It's again a group activity to an extent. Compared to what other roles, I think if you read my memo, there are 3 parts of it, and the first part of it is the strategic thinking, how India thinks. And during my interaction with Indian diplomats and lawmakers, what they are saying that we are willing to support on as many areas as possible, but those issue areas has to remain within our way of thinking. So for example, India wants all climate related issues to be dealt at the level of UNFCCC, the UN's Forum for Climate Change. Now, US and other countries have long been trying to get those issues under the guise of human security to brought to the Security Council. Now, where this India says that clipping its wings and it doesn't have a future say on any of those areas. So climate, yes, India is willing to work with United States, but when you say that we want to move the remit to Security Council itself from UNFCCC, I think that India will be stopping short itself from supporting. So many new convergence areas are there. India is willing to support, but as I said, that there are certain Indian ways of thinking on how to support, and once they are breached, India will stop short of supporting the United States. On Michael's question, there are can India and US ever be really natural strategic partners? In terms of values, democratic values, broadly Indians agree. But what they see is that despite believing in these values, it doesn't stop US from playing its politics. And these are again this is not my assessment. This is the Indian side's broad assessment. So, for example, India supported a couple of military interventions directly, indirectly, either by abstention or by positively signing off on it. And what has happened after that? So India sees that whenever you speak initially of human rights, it eventually turns into great power politics. And again, it sees that many issues where United States takes position, it's not normatively desirable. So last year, there were two particular resolutions on vaccine as a global good, to which United States and Israel, only those two were not signing on those resolutions. So what India says is that we believe in your ideals to a certain extent, but those ideals is not stopping you from playing your politics. So allow us to do things our way. And between this tug of war, I think there are some possible areas of convergences that both countries have to find and to work together. So I would say that at belief level, they are repeating Vajpayee's words that we are natural ally. They both think of democracy. They both think of rules-based order, but their position in global hierarchy is different. Their way of playing global politics is different, and that keeps them poles apart. And that is the primary reason why the strategic difference is there. And I don't see things changing dramatically in near future. It will be gradual. Thank you.
Thank you, Trayu. One thing that's sort of come up a lot in these conversations is sort of thinking about the broader trend lines for the region in the years to come. And I think going back to Asma, your presentation, one question that we received was, oftentimes we look at crises between India and Pakistan and we see a lot of mirroring of the previous crisis, but then sometimes something new. So what would be your sort of concern or thing to watch for as a potential new twist or new area that needs greater attention when we're looking at potential crises between India and Pakistan?
Okay. Well, I guess the question is regarding the new twist. Your voice was cutting down, so I could. Okay.
Oh, apologies. Yes, the new twist.
Well, the new twist in, I think, in any future India-Pakistan crisis, in my views, is ongoing China-India border conflict. And previously, China would always come in and try to play the role of mediator. So one might ask whether China would change its mediatory role in the next India-Pakistan crisis. So I think China has a specific objective in keeping India's regional aggressiveness in check, and it has to do with US-China's great power rivalry. As far as South Asia is concerned, I think China will continue to play the role of a mediator and discourage escalation of crisis between India and Pakistan. I don't think that it wants to keep India and Pakistan as an adversary, and it's more of a short-term approach to telling India not to join the US-led campaign against Beijing. So I agree that there is a new twist, that of China-India border conflict, but I don't think so that it will have spillover effect, or it will spill over in India-Pakistan crisis. Thank you.
Thanks, Asma. And with the time we have remaining, I want to ask just a couple more questions of Sarab and Fiza. So Sarab, the first question is for you. Are the differences in your research that you've noticed between the Taliban and the Islamic State moreover priorities and not in the latest analysis ideological? And is a large part of the disagreement a matter of factional leadership divisions?
Thank you, Brigitte. Ideological differences certainly are there. While ISKP is not as rigid ideologically as Islamic State Central, but still the Taliban being a nationalist force and ISKP being a pan-Islamist outfit with extra-regional goals, ideologically, there are differences because the Taliban's Hanafi ideology does not sit well with the Islamic State Salafi ideology. And also, there is a disagreement in terms of leadership, of course, because politically the Taliban and ISKP leaders have almost similar titles, so leadership differences will persist. And but more than leadership, it's in terms of objectives and how the objectives are achieved. ISKP is more sectarian and more brutal, even by Taliban standards. So often it's not palatable for certain militant sympathizers in the region.
Thank you, Sarab. And then one more question for you, Fiza. Considering the secular and religious Pashtun political parties in Pakistan want peace in Afghanistan, what are their expectations of the mainstream political parties, for instance, the PTI, the PMLN, the PPP, in post-conflict peace building and reconciliation? And is there enough synergy between the Pashtun and mainstream political parties in Pakistan to secure a collective vision of peace for Afghanistan?
So, first, thank you, Dr. Farhan, for asking. It's a difficult scenario. But yes, you're right. PTI particularly would be a problem if Pakistan would try and include Pashtun political parties in the Afghanistan policy, because they are competitors in KPK. Involving Pashtun political parties in the Afghanistan peace process means that their influence in their constituencies would increase as well, and PTI definitely would not like it. But PMLN and PPP are most likely to support Pashtun and both religious political parties because they have no direct interest in Afghanistan as such. So they might side with anyone who's who's more powerful and who's more influential, and with which their interest coincide. But PTI can be a problem. So they would have to come up with a solution that satisfies everyone and create a win-win situation, which is, I know, difficult, but that's exactly is the meaning of democracy, for me at least. To have dissenting views and then converge them together.
Thank you, Fiza. And we are now coming close to the end of our time. So I think one question I just want to pose for each of our panelists. You spent the past year immersed in research on your current subjects, and you could maybe summarize in just a few words or one sentence, kind of the main takeaways that you want to leave your audience with from your research and what they should be looking out for in your policy memo to come. Chirayu, I'm going to start with you, and then.
Yeah, so just 2 lines. The situation is not going to change dramatically. The gaps are going to continue. The only thing my memo suggests is that there are pressing issues where both want to work together, but cannot work together because differing in modalities. And I think this is one area to watch out for, that if they can at least agree on the tactics, I think there is much more both countries can achieve together. And that is one thing I want to leave my audience with, thinking about how these democracies, they want to work together, but can't work together.
Thanks. And Sarab, I'll hand it over to you next.
Okay, thank you, Brigitte. I'll just say that to progress in the current situation in Afghanistan, it is very imperative that there is a larger commitment and investment in terms of diplomatic outreach to the various parties involved by all the interested countries in the region as well as outside, such as the United States. And also, our larger focus needs to be on political stability and not just military presence or military results, given that without a stable political situation, conflict is prone to arise once again in some form or the other, and peace will be short-lived. So for the long-term settlement, it is imperative that a solid political foundation is reached in Afghanistan. Thank you.
And Asma?
Well, I would like to mention that the situation in South Asia, with the growing military modernization, arms crisis instability, and existence of Kashmir conflict, the situation between India and Pakistan is tensions between both countries are going, and with these competing narratives, there are the chances of miscalculations and misperceptions. So at the time when there are the chances of fast flag operation in the region, it seems like it is difficult to prevent the crisis in future. So the regional, so the only way forward is the conflict management. It is necessary to both states to engage in talks and engage in talks, so that communication is the key. If they will communicate, then the communication is key, and they need to develop a framework for conflict management, which will be useful to maintain peace and stability in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. And finally, Fiza, for the last comment.
So adding to what Saurav has already said, that political stability is required for ending violence in Afghanistan. My main takeaway is just to understand that the violence in Afghanistan has a long history. And to establish peace in Afghanistan, if anything, that's the key that's the world needs, and everyone who wants peace in Afghanistan is patience. Be patient. It will take time, and it will suffer from several interruptions, several episodes of violence. But if you have this in mind, that you want peace in Afghanistan, then continue doing anything you can for Afghanistan, and there will be peace.
And with that, we are about at time. I want to thank all of our visiting fellows for all of your work this year, and for adapting through, as many of us were all doing during the turbulent year of 2020. And for those of you watching, if you would like more information about the Visiting Fellowship, or to follow the analysis of our current fellows, they are writing regularly for South Asian Voices, and more information on the fellowship can be found there as well. And be sure to look out for their policy memos coming out in the coming months. And with that, I will wish you all a great evening in South Asia, and a good start to your Thursday for those of you joining us from the US.